Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to lift this. I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me to come and talk to you today about quite a different control context, and that is the context of carp control. Let me just orient myself. So I'll give you an insight into what really refers to carp control in a couple of slides' time, but I just want to let you know that this talk really is beyond culling and manual control methods. Some of the concepts I'll talk about really do relate to social acceptability of using biotechnologies more generally. And in a particular context, in using the carp herpes virus as a biocontrol agent. I'll focus on perceptions of risk, burden and trust that we found primarily in our qualitative work out in the field, but also show you some stats from the National Attitude Survey that we conducted. It's just a bit slow. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to put a slide together. This was something that was asked of me last year before this meeting was actually cancelled on SLO, or social licence to operate. I just wanted to put a couple of nuances around that phrase because I hear it quite a lot, and it's usually shorthand among researchers in research organisations and industry. I just lost my slides on here, but that's okay, I can see them up there. And it usually refers to social acceptance as an outcome or the public engagement process. And beyond those research conversations, and the currency it has, that it does have quite a lot of currency when we talk about the need to engage or the need to find social acceptability. It does have limits beyond that. So my kind of, I guess, advice would be just to make sure that when we talk about social licence to operate, we actually have some context around that, understand that there are social licence to operate frameworks, that there are models around that exist in particular contexts, like the coal seam gas industry, for example. They've been used to look at well-being in other areas, but it's really a particular concept that has meaning for some, and for others can be perhaps an offensive way to talk about engagement processes. So I hear it often misinterpreted by non-social scientists, and it's meant as a static kind of transactional process sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. So I just wanted to, I guess, put a little caution around how that phrase is used, and when you use it, just to make sure that the people that you're using it with actually understand what you're referring to. Thanks. So just a slide on what I use as the carp problem shorthand. For those that are not familiar with the carp problem in southeast Australia mainly. So the common carp is the species that we're referring to, and at the moment current estimates are that it represents 80 to 90% of the biomass of the Murray-Darling Basin. So that's, quite an inundation in some regional, rural, and also outer suburbs as well in some parts of New South Wales. It's assumed by the National Carp Control Plan that traditional control measures such as trapping, containment and removal are actually ineffective at scale. So that's why there's quite a number of research projects that were currently underway and almost finished in terms of trying to understand the feasibility of releasing cyprid herpes virus 3, or the carp virus. And it's a species-specific carp virus and is highly contagious in fish-to-fish contact. So CSIRO was invited to conduct some social science research. I'm a social scientist. I use a lot of qualitative methodologies in my work, but my team used a combination of quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And the two research questions that we were actually asked by the National Carp Control Plan to investigate related to risk-related perceptions around the release. So these were really community and also more general perceptions around the release of the carp herpes virus. And what were the social risk endpoints for the use of the carp virus as a biological control agent? And that for us really meant deal breakers. So in what circumstances would the carp herpes virus not be accepted, or what impacts would be totally unacceptable? And some of those I'll speak to in just a second, but one of them that was raised early on would be masses of dead or dying fish in local catchments that were unable to be removed quickly, for example. So, and also transmission to native species. So the transmission of the herpes virus to native species was also raised as a deal breaker or a social risk endpoint. So the National Representative Survey was a stratified sample of metro and regional respondents, just over 2,000 respondents we had in that National Latitude survey. And we also conducted a number of focus groups in regional areas and rural areas. Charleville, the Lower Lakes and Coorong in South Australia, Griffith in New South Wales and in the outer suburbs of Sydney were also part of the focus groups there. So just generally, before I get into some more detail, at the time of us coming on board, we were told that these were the issues in the carp control context. Some of those were a real concern about disruption to natural ecosystems. And remember, I'm here talking about perceptions, which are as real as kind of objective risk assessments and as legitimate. So timely removal of dead fish, I just mentioned, long-term potential human and animal health implications, the efficacy of the actual agent used, and the last issue of concern that was raised before we really came on board and did the survey and the focus groups was the perception that there were more economically viable ways to utilise the current carp for example, horticultural or agricultural inputs. So this is just a snippet of the National Latitude Survey. I've just got 2 slides on this. You'll see the dark blue, I'm sorry the font's quite small. The dark blue columns represent respondents from the Murray-Darling Basin. The lighter blue are respondents from metro areas. And the scale is 1 to 7, so 7 being strongly in agreement that the impacts that were listed there were in fact true. So you can see that there was a generally a good level of agreement that the release of the biocontrol agent, so for carp control, would actually have the impacts that were stated. If I go now to show you some of the open-ended responses, so respondents were provided an opportunity to write as much as they wanted about some of the risks that they had or the concerns. You'll see that there's a number of risks there listed, risks to other species associated with waterways, for example, risks to humans. But I wanted to highlight to you that actual trust in science was relatively high. So we've got an acknowledgement that there's a general agreement there of benefits of a release of a biocontrol agent. There's fairly strong trust in science and scientists. Yet, and actually before I move on to the local perspectives, which actually have different meanings to these actual concerns, I just wanted to give you some information of some path modelling that we actually did and I won't present that data to you, but the path modelling we did on the National Attitude Survey has revealed that the strongest predictor of acceptance was perceived virus efficacy, and very close after that, with still strong predictors, was descriptive norms and social norms. So social norms is whatever my friends or family thought. That was a strong predictor of support, as were descriptive norms, so the belief that I ought to support the biocontrol program. So virus efficacy, social norms and descriptive norms were the strongest predictors of support for the biocontrol program. So that, you know, that might be a surprise to some who would have thought there were other indicators or predictors. So when we went locally, the story was quite different, and some of this information was a surprise to the National Carp Control Plan. There was a really, my description is a sophisticated understanding of the carp problem, where there was talk about local biodiversity impacts of climate change or climate variability. There were discussions about agricultural activity and, you know, water governance arrangements, for example, and this led to a degraded water system, and that degraded system actually allowed proliferation of carp to explode. So it wasn't a carp problem, so to speak. It was this more sophisticated understanding of water systems and the environment which people lived. Trust was variable, so I showed you some data from the National Attitude Survey where trust was high. Well, here locally, trust kind of manifested differently. If you didn't trust your local council or your local government organisation, because that's who you saw was going to be part of the implementation program or part of the cleanup, well then you might not trust the program itself. So that was very different. So trust was beyond the information source or beyond the organisation. It was actually a trust relationship, and it was more nuanced than we'd been thought to believe. And one, just the second last point there, trust was diminished by historical biocontrol failures. So we heard a lot about cane toads. At the time we were travelling, there was an influenza. At the time we were travelling, it was winter months, and influenza was appearing a different strain to what the vaccination was available at that time of year. And people raised that and linked it directly to the potential ineffectiveness or the potential evolution of the virus itself. So they linked a human influenza virus when they spoke about some of their concerns with respect to herpes virus, and thought, well, if the human influenza virus could mutate, there was a good chance the carp herpes virus could mutate, and what would that mean? So there was a link. So these are perceptions, and these are the kinds of things I think for any communication program of COTS control beyond traditional methods might need to consider. The last theme I'll leave you with here is the expectation of inclusion and engagement. And this was across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants in the conversations, as well as across kind of local people who had some attachment to, whether it was a livelihood attachment or a recreation attachment to the actual catchment that was affected. And there was an expectation that local communities would be part of the program, would be part of the conversations around the program, would actually be engaged deliberately. So some of our insights for what I think might be insights for COTS further, particularly in COTS control methods, might be that really people do hold more sophisticated understandings of a problem than kind of what might be communicated. The National Carp Control Plan really talked about quick fix herpes virus solutions. And really when we talked to people in communities, they did not see the problem that way. The attribution for the National Carp Control Plan was of a single cause, carp proliferation. But in fact, when we talked to people on the ground, they saw multiple drivers of carp inundation. I think we need to think about perhaps thinking about broader goals of water health, for example, in that context. The other thing that I'd like to caution against might be in this case is that drawing parallels from diverse socio-ecological contexts to inform implementation decisions can be risky. I think there are real differences between talking about land-based invasive species context and then transferring that data to look at water-based native species context, for example. So I think, when we talk about the cultural acceptance, for example, of culling cane toads and COTS because they're aesthetically not pleasing creatures, they're not furry and likeable, and saying that would be okay, I think we'd have to be careful about the conclusions we make, because people are actually quite complex. And we know from our work in not just in carp but in synthetic biology applications that emotional responses are a strong predictor of how you might think about a particular intervention. Trust is variable and dynamic. I think, you should assume a complexity and diversity. And trust really goes beyond information credibility or information sources. It's really about relationships and processes. Perceived fairness in the distribution of risks and benefits is another, theme that might be worth kind of contemplating as you go forward. Knowledge is one fairly small contributor to attitudes. We've seen that again in multiple synthetic biology contexts and also in the carp herpes virus case. For talking about acceptance or acceptability or tolerance, what's most important is emotional response as well as social norms, and whether you think that you ought to have some position. So your family, friends and your emotions actually play a far stronger role in your attitudes towards a particular intervention than does knowledge. And the process, I'll just leave at that last point, the process of engagement is very important. This is not news to people who work in the GBR, but I just want to reiterate that some of the National Carp Control work was focused about engagement in town hall type meetings or one-way consultation processes, and kind of people were onto that. And it wasn't a great way to have conversations about the problem or to engage local communities. So I think thinking about engagement in a more genuine, deliberative process, particularly when we think about novel control methods, is absolutely critical. And I think that's it. So thank you very much.